Thank you all for coming for speaking classes. I know it's a crazy time, so I appreciate you all being here. It's not a bad place to be when it's kind of cold and rainy out. All right, so I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about the work that's in the gallery today, and also about some projects that I'm working on right now that are a continuation of some of the work that you see in there. So feel free to ask questions if you have them along the way. So the work that you see in the gallery are from two distinct bodies of work called Choice Cuts and Dish. Primarily the work is from the body of work called Dish, so that's what we titled the exhibition. But both bodies of work really have to do with the intersection of foodways and social justice in local communities, particularly those that are in the American South. So I thought I'd start just by defining what foodways are. For those of you who aren't familiar, foodways describes the interrelated food systems, conceptualization and evaluation, procurement, preservation, preparation, consumption, and nutrition shared by all members of a particular society, the eating habits and culinary practices that guide the production and the consumption of food. This term derives from folkways, and so that just describes the habits, the traditions of a certain community of folks, and then foodways speaks specifically to the agricultural and consumption kind of part of that. So just some example of foodways quickly. Slow food emphasizes the importance of local traditional cooking, and it promotes sustainable and ethical food production. This is a movement that started in Italy, but in response to globalization, or excuse me, it started in Italy in response to globalization, fast food, and industrial agriculture. It began in like the 1980s and then has moved overseas, and we see it in local farmers markets and co-ops and all of that. So that's an example of how foodways can inform, you know, our everyday and what we see, how we engage with one another. There are a lot of artists that are working in foodways studies. One is Michael Rockowitz. He uses food as a means of facilitating community conversation. This is a piece called Enemy Kitchen, where he collaborated with his Iraqi Jewish mother to cook traditional Baghdadi recipes for U.S. veterans of the Iraq War. And he served these veterans from a local food truck and offered people the chance to experience food culture that has continued to confront prejudice due to the aftermath of the war. So, kind of like Rockowitz, the reason I brought him up is that I'm also using food as a means to facilitate conversation about social justice, climate justice, which I'll talk more about as we now move into my work. So I said these two, the work in here is from two distinct bodies of work. This one is called Choice Cuts. So I started thinking about the intersection of food around 2019. I initially was working in a similar style to some of the ones that you see in the gallery, like, I don't know, can you see a pointer up there? I think you can. The one on the right over here, I guess your left, Barbecue Nation, kind of has this small vignette contextual kind of feel to it. I was initially looking at narrative textiles and looking at them as a reflection of the way that social and political changes can be told through the tradition of printmaking and storytelling on these textiles. And so a lot of the work, or the research for that particular work, was happening in the archives of museums or at academic institutions. And so I just wrapped up this work that I called Campaign Julienne that looked at French toile patterns and borrowed imagery from them. And I was in the archives at the Atlanta History Museum trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And I really wanted to focus on you know, the way the imagery from marketing campaigns in the 1920s 1920s related to women's suffrage, but I really wasn't finding anything in the archives. And so I was walking out one day, and I saw this exhibition called Barbecue Nation. It was this room that was just illuminated, right, with neon, and I'd been in this dark kind of dungeon basement all day, and I thought, that looks refreshing, I'm gonna walk in there. And it totally changed the trajectory of my work. So I was walking through the exhibition, still kind of with these conversations in the back of my head happening about women's suffrage and gender equity and everything. And I walked into the exhibition and I thought, well, like, this is a place where that happens too, right? In the tradition of barbecue, those gender roles are kind of switched, right? It's a domestic space where those gender roles are reversed. So I started thinking about the ways that food is used to objectify, categorize women at where domestic spaces might be used as a means of suppressing women, but also as a means of liberation or as a way to reaffirm agency in a particular place. So I was thinking about all of those dualities when I walked into that exhibition. And like I said, my research completely shifted and moved into foodways. So the work began to be inspired by this exhibition called Barbecue Nation. Each drawing included within the Choice Cut series reflects the phenomenon of that gender role reversal in these particular domestic spaces, or the kind of hard definition of gender roles in domestic spaces through specific narratives of gender inequity that have been perpetuated through the preparation, the presentation, the marketing of food. So I was building upon the visual language of those narrative textiles in Campaign Julienne that I talked about earlier, in that it was still this collage-like methodology. It was still these small vignettes that needed to be read contextually together in order to understand the underlying narrative. But again, it shifted to this kind of food-centered focus. So here's an image that you can see in the gallery of Barbecue Nation, which was, the imagery was derived from that exhibition that I walked through. But this work was still really defined by archival research. Donut Dollies was a piece that was inspired by research that I did about these women called Donut Dollies that existed during World War II and the Vietnam War. These women were encouraged to go to active war zones, enrolling through the Red Cross to become waitresses, serve donuts and coffees out of mobile trucks to the soldiers as a way to increase morale and remind them of home and what they were fighting for. And the women, in order to become a Donut Dolly, had to apply, and the application was much more rigorous than that that was put forward for the soldiers. So the women had to be college graduates. They had to be at least 25 years of age. They had to have excellent references. They had to have letters of reference. Pass physical examinations that were similar to those that the soldiers had to pass. And they had to also have an outstanding personality as demonstrated by their interviews. So this piece was really about that, kind of the absurdity of what we were asking women to do in times of conflict, right? Like what we saw their role to be, especially in this kind of domestic sense. And maybe what they could also be utilized for if we opened that up a bit. So when I was creating Choice Cuts, like I said, I started kind of doing this in 2019. It was lasting for about 2 years. There was a lot going on in those 2 years, right? We found ourselves in the middle of a pandemic. There was political turmoil. There was social strife across the country. And like everyone, I was feeling a bit isolated. I don't know what to do in this moment. And I began thinking a lot about food and the gathering table and what was missing in that time. And really, I was also thinking about the significance of the gathering table, what place it holds in our personal lives, what significance it holds for us culturally. And so this marked another shift in my research. I started to move away from these archival kind of deep dives that I was doing in institutions, and I got much more interested in going out into the community and collecting oral histories in order to inform the work. So questions about power dynamics have always been at the center of my research, but I started thinking more specifically about food and power dynamics and the question, who prepares the food and who gets a seat at the table? So this is where I really started thinking about foodways, right? Before it was gender equity, this moved into how food could reflect our culture, our social changes, immigration, climate change, all of those things, right? And I started doing research on the ground in the American South. This was in part because I'm a native of this region. I'm from Georgia, so I was familiar with the cultural tendencies and regional challenges, but it's also because this is a really dynamic region, right? It's got a history that's scarred by colonialism. It deals with all of the natural disasters for the most part that we have going on across the country. And then we have, excuse me, a history of immigration in this part of the country as well as we do across the entire country, but a very particular kind of immigration lens here. And so you can see all of this reflected in our cultural ingredients. As immigrants move to this region, we change our regional dishes to adopt, new ingredients. Climate change changes the ingredients that are available to us, right? Public policy changes things that we have access to. And so I started thinking about that in my work, how food can reflect all of those things. And so that's where I moved into dish. So drawing is still at the center of the practice, but I wanted to fold ways in which I could engage with the community actively into my practice. So I started organizing community meals whereby local residents and food providers could come together and share stories about the preparation and presentation of classic regional recipes, and also share stories about their food traditions that were related to the gathering table. And from this exchange, I would archive the recipes and stories and the photographic documentation and a series of drawings, which you can see in the gallery in there, as well as a printed catalog and an online archive. And so I have some examples of the catalog in the gallery as well. The catalog kind of takes the form of a junior league cookbook, and I guess like in an effort to acknowledge the inherent activism in that history, right? That these were informal forms of documentation, of social movements. It was a place where women could contribute, fundraise, be active participants in social movements historically, and I wanted to kind of harken back to that in the catalog. So I want to talk to you a little bit about a version of this project that took place in Springfield, but this is a continuing project that is location specific and happening across the country. So a version took place in Springfield, Ohio, and so I had a solo exhibition in Springfield of several of the drawings that you saw in the gallery. And really, as I engaged with the community there in Springfield, the project began to explore the evolution of regional recipes and food traditions that were impacted by the Great Migration, right? So between 1910 and 1970, Ohio saw a large influx of African-American migrants fleeing the American South in hopes of finding new opportunities in the North and in industrial cities, as many places did across the country. And so during this time, the social fabric of Ohio changed significantly. And the recipes, the food traditions, everything changed along with that, right? And so Springfield was located like maybe 80 miles to the northeast of Cincinnati. So it got a lot of the influx because it was located very close to an industrial city which provided job opportunities. So I made some drawings that document the migration of these foodways from the American South to Ohio. That you can see here. There's some details of that work. But then I also organized a community recipe exchange as part of the exhibition, and participants contributed to this by bringing written recipes or food stories. And in exchange for the recipes, I created a custom designed plate in which meals that were printed in the catalog, the recipes could be served on in the aftermath. So I gave them a plate, and then they were also sent a catalog once they were printed. And so the drawing at the center of the plate acknowledges the history of the Great Migration and its influence on Ohio's changing identity. And so it's designed to represent the Meat and Three, right, which was historically in the American South for people that were working in agriculture, but then moved to the northeastern cities as well. So with each iteration of the project that I do, I notice interesting trends, like in our conversations. So in Ohio, a lot of the conversations were about immigration and stories of immigration, describing a determination to continue cultural food traditions and family gatherings. So I thought I would just read to you really quick some of the recipes, because they're interesting. This is one for mashed potatoes. This person said, "My grandma Reza is from Russia and survived through World War II. Of course, even when the war was over, the life was not easy for many people. Hunger took a toll on many people. I was told stories of my grandma eating grass and whatever she could find these times. People used to boil wallpaper to make hot water thicker on the stomach. Potatoes became a big staple food in many families. I spent many years cooking with Grandma while hearing her stories. Many were so heartbreaking. She is such a brave and inspiring woman in my life. Most foods we cooked contained potatoes. Potato dumplings, potato pancakes, and mashed potatoes, which were my absolute favorite. Boiled potatoes use only hot milk, butter, and salt. Simple." There are some other ones, but in the interest of time, I'll keep going. Also, as part of the Ohio project, conversations revolved around public policy and issues of access, because in Springfield, it used to be the center for agricultural equipment production for a very long time, from the Civil War to about the 1950s. And so it actually had the largest concentration of mansions in the state of Ohio. But then with the collapse of manufacturing and other blue-collar jobs, and then the collapse of the economy in 2008, it took a really sharp economic decline, and it was actually the worst of any metropolitan area in the country. I think the median income declined by like 27% or something. And so now public programming, providing access for those who are experiencing food insecurity is very important there. So I worked with the Springfield City School District food staff, Jefferson Street Oasis Community Garden, Project Jericho staff, families and teens. Those are that's an organization that helps with food insecurity specifically. I think I have them all listed here, so I won't read through them. But they were the major contributors to the catalog, and so this life experience is something that is very distinctly reflected within the narratives that are shared in that catalog. I'll share quickly about a project that I'm working on now. I'm working on a project in New Orleans right now, also called DISH. I lived in Covington, which is like right on the North Shore of New Orleans, from 2013 to 2017. And during these 4 years, I learned a lot about New Orleans culture, and really learned that it's defined as much by carnival season and Mardi Gras as it is by the environmental challenges that they're facing. And so we had lots of floods happening, and all of this while I was living there and teaching that disrupted our semesters. And so I always wanted to go back and kind of document the changes that were happening in Louisiana and the cultural loss that was kind of happening as a result of climate change. So with the support of the Tulane Bywater Institute and a residency called A Studio in the Woods, I'm working with local residents, scholars, and food providers to understand the ways in which rising waters due to climate change have affected local wildlife and agriculture and contributed to increasing instability in the national food systems. So I'm creating a series of drawings with that as well that you can see in the exhibition. But something that's a little bit new about this project is that I'm also working with a filmmaker named Christian Malone. He's an Emmy award-winning cinematographer and director of documentary films that focus on social justice. And so we're producing a short film and moving images that tell the oral histories of this community from the mouths of the residents. And so here are just some of the folks that we talked to on my first visit to New Orleans, and I thought I'd just play a nice little clip from Fred here to wrap up the talk. So I'm going to have Fred. This is Fred on the left. So he lived in the 9th floor and grew up there.
Oh, it's a country now. It might even they just dirty now. Like they just think you're close. Because we weren't close to the downtown area, right? So it's almost like we have our own. So we separated my water from the rest of the city. Sometimes people even say it was forgotten about the city. Like some of the municipalities or the services, like it wasn't developing everything. My grandmother used to have pigs, chickens, turtles, and all this stuff in the yard, and they would eat them, you know. And then the city came and stopped that, shut that down with ordinances and stuff like that. So then you had to start going to the store because you couldn't. So you get fined, and you get lesser quality, and you're spending more, and you didn't have the money for it, and you also forgetting the skill set and all that stuff. But I started it off with the people of the country out there because when I was a kid, really, before 10, maybe 8, something. But we go with my grandma. And my grandma, bless us, there's some country stuff, and this is even a little much for me, but, she got a gumbo pot. She's cooking for my mind, she had 12 kids or something. So that time, it's full of robins. Red robins? It's full of them. But they only had, and I was like, well, you just, and I watching him, and he just pop his little breast out with a thumb, like with a thumb, to clean around and pop his breast out. So I've had the robin soup, so, I've definitely had a variety of food in my day.
So he was hilarious, and he had so many interesting food stories, but it was really amazing to listen to that change that he was retelling from his grandmother, right? Where she was able to grow chickens, provide for herself, and then have to move into a space because of public policy where she had to find alternative ways of providing for herself and her family within her economic means.
That area.
Oh, sorry. You don't have to listen like that. So I'm hoping that through this multidisciplinary presentation of all of these oral histories and foodways, that it offers viewers a clear pathway to engage in creative action. Meals have historically offered a unique opportunity for Americans from diverse socioeconomic and political backgrounds to gather together and discover connections. And the development of the associated programming, or like all of the different kind of facets of this project, hopefully brings that power of the gathering table out into communities and encourages constructive conversation about public policy and food insecurity and climate awareness. So there are projects scheduled for to wrap up in New Orleans, in New Hampshire this year, this summer, and then in Mobile, Alabama next year. And then of course you all contributed awesome recipes in there, and I'm hoping to work on a catalog and maybe a film iteration here in South Florida since I live here. So if you have any recommendations of people I should talk to or want to share more in-depth stories, please reach out. Contact information, Angel has my contact information.